Welcome to VLearn, Virtual Learning Network. This is session number 27 of the subject India Earliest Times to the 8th Century AD, and the chapter is Early State Formation in the Deccan. Topics to be covered are Introduction, Sources, About State Formation, Antecedents, Geographical Background, Outline History of Satavahan Dynasty, Settlement Pattern, Administration and Society. Introduction. In this unit, we will study the changes in the Deccan. The major power that rose in the Deccan around the 1st century BC was the Satyavahan dynasty. Here we shall concentrate on the political and social structure of the Deccan under the Satavahanas. Sources. The names of the Satvahana rulers, also known as the Andhras, occur in the list of kings found in the Puranas. There are many difficulties in using these lists as sources of history without critically comparing them with other sources. For example, the names of the kings and the duration of their rule vary in the different Puranas. So the names of the Satyavahan rulers, also known as Andhras, occur in the list of kings found in Puranas, and there are a lot of difficulties as these lists of sources of history are different in different Puranas, and also without critically comparing them with other sources, it is very difficult to compile them. And for example, the names of the kings and their duration, that is also mentioned in different Puranas. Moreover, information about the kings is interwoven with myths and legends, and one has to carefully distinguish between facts and legendary stories. So the kings, the information about the kings, that is also interwoven with myths as well as legends, and one has to distinguish between the truth as well as what is the legendary story which is there. The Puranas are nevertheless useful when studied with other sources such as coins and inscriptions. About state formation, we should now pose the question, what is a state and how does the emergence of state bring about changes in society? There are many theories which seek to explain the reasons for the emergence of a state. Reasons for the emergence of a state vary from region to region. So, what is a state and how does the emergence of state bring about changes in society? There are many theories to explain the reasons for the emergence of the state. In certain cases, the development of trade and the growth of urban centers could lead to the rise of a state. As and when the trade, commerce, the money exchange that increased, and the growth of urban centers, the centers of urbanization as well as modernization, they increased, that also led to the rise of the institution of state. Other theories suggest that population pressure or conquest could also result in change in the political structure. So population increasing, and that also population conquest, different people conquesting different empires, that also resulted in a change in the political structure. Antecedents. The eastern Deccan was occupied a little later in the second half of the first millennium BC by iron-using communities. These were by and large village settlements, the abode of a large number of tribes. So, in the second half of the first millennium BC, a lot of village settlements that also and a lot of communities also increased. These were village settlements, the abode of a large number of tribes. Early Sanskrit literature, particularly in the epics and the Puranas, mention several tribes such as the Andhras, Sabaras, Pulindas, etc. who lived in the Deccan. Many of these are also mentioned by Ashoka in his inscriptions. But most of these references are of a general nature, and it is difficult to define the region where they lived in the Deccan. So, most of these references, these are of a general nature, and it is also very difficult to define where they lived in Deccan. And early Sanskrit literature, particularly the epics and the Puranas, they mention several tribes who lived in the Deccan, and that is also mentioned by Ashoka in his inscriptions. Geographical background. The Deccan Peninsula is divided into the plateau region and the coastal plains by the hill ranges of the eastern and western Ghats. The Andhra coast is much wider than the Konkan coast to the west. The general slope of the plateau is to the east, and as a result, the major rivers such as the Mahanadi, Godavari and Krishna flow eastwards into the Bay of Bengal. The deltas and valleys of the rivers provide fertile areas for settlements. The deltas and the valleys, as they are wet of the rivers, they provide fertile areas for the settlements. The general slope of the plateau to the east is also and that is also the result. The major rivers such as Mahanadi, Godavari as well as the Krishna flow eastwards into the Bay of Bengal. Perhaps a significant aspect of the geography of the Deccan is the fact that the hill ranges of the plateau Kal can be crossed only along the passes. Outline history of the Satavahan dynasty. According to Purana tradition, it was Simukha Satavahan who established Satavahana power. Kanha or Krishna, his brother, is perhaps known to us from an inscription at Nasik. Another record that lists several rulers of the dynasty is the Nanghat inscription of Queen Nayanika, the widowed queen of Satkarni who performed Vedic sacrifices. Nanghat was a major pass connecting Junad with the coast, and in a cave at the head of the pass, portraits of the Satavahan rulers were carved. Settlement pattern. On the basis of the find spots of their earliest inscriptions, it can be said that the Satvahans began their rule in the western Deccan. A 2nd century AD inscription of Gautami Putra Satkarni's mother from Nasik provides information about the extent of the kingdom under the Satvahanas. The mention of both the western and the eastern Ghats as forming parts of Gautami Putra Satkarni's empire suggests that by this time Satvahan rule covered the entire Deccan and that it was divided into haras or districts. So on the basis of the find spots of the inscriptions, the Satvahans began their rule in the western Deccan. And the 2nd century AD, there is also the inscription of Gautami Putra, Satkarni's mother from Nasik. And also the mention of western and eastern Ghats forming parts of Gautami Putra suggests that the entire Deccan was divided into aharas or districts. West Coast. On the west coast, there were a series of ports at Bharuch, Kalyan, Sopara and Chaul, and continuing further south all along the Konkan coast. To these ports, commodities were brought from the inland centers through passes along the western Ghats. An important text for understanding the nature of travel and trade is the 1st century AD. So, on the west coast, there were a series of ports all along the Konkan coast, and to these ports commodities were brought from the inland centers through passes along the western Ghats. An important text for understanding the nature of travel and trade is of 1st century AD. So the nature of travel and trade is elaborately explained in the 1st century AD. Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written by the anonymous Greek sailor, it provides a graphic account of the dangerous passage through the narrow mouth of the Gulf of Cambay to Bharuch. So the passage that was from the narrow mouth of the Gulf of Cambay to Bharuch, that was a dangerous passage because the mouth was very narrow. Inland settlements. Across the western Ghats on the inland side, the major concentrations of settlements were around Nasik, Junad within a 30-kilometer radius of Karle, and further south in the upper Krishna basin around Kolhapur. These ports handled much of the trade in the 1st century AD between India and the Mediterranean region, and were also linked by the overland trans-peninsular route across the Deccan to centers in Andhra and along the east coast. So these ports, they handled much of the trade in the 1st century AD between India and Mediterranean region, and they were also linked by the overland trans-peninsular route across the Deccan to centers in Andhra. Administration under the Satvahans was much simpler than under the Mauryas. Inscriptions refer to ministers who were in charge of various functions. Among other things, they served as treasury officers and maintained land records. The exact number of ministers is not known, so each minister was in charge of a particular function. Basically, they served as treasury officers and maintained land records. These ministers were appointed directly by the king, and the post of a minister does not seem to have been hereditary, that is, passed from father to son. They were perhaps paid in money from the revenue collected by the state. Society. The social structure of the Deccan under the Satvahans shows many features which are different from those prescribed in Sanskrit texts such as the Manusmriti. For example, many inscriptions of the Satvahan rulers mention the names of their mothers rather than those of their fathers, such as Gautami Putra, Satkarni or Satakarni, son of Gautami. This is not keeping with the Dharma Shastras, which state that in the approved forms of marriage, the bride acquires the gotra of her husband and loses that of the father. So that was all about the administration under that particular time and how it developed the dynasty of Satyavahins, that how that dynasty also grew. These are some of the questions. You have to do it yourself. Question 1. Can you name the scholars of society who donated land during this period? And next, write a short note on the inland trade routes of this period. That's all. Thank you. Happy learning. We learning.